Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
Wa alaikum assalam.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. As-salatu was-salam ala Nabi Kareem Muhammad wa alihi tayyibin wa sahbihi salihin. Greetings and salams and Ramadan Kareem to everyone watching this. Probably from the safety of your homes, behind your doors, probably in hidden bunkers for some of you. We're kind of facing a very testing time where last year at the I3 conference, obviously we could have it in person, but now everyone around the world is doing their work from their homes and having kind of online conferences instead. So I appreciate it's testing time, and may Allah shorten this test, make it easy for everybody, and grant shifa to those who are currently being trialed with the travails of this test. So, Ameen. So I've firstly want to thank the I3 for inviting me again for their conference on fortifying the Muslim mind, and for my fellow panelists for also participating. The discussion that isn't kind of scheduled now is really on secularism, but it's really going to be on the implications on belief or faith. Now, I don't really like to refer to Islam as a faith or our belief as a faith, because you can't really have faith in something that is actually a certainty when you have looked into it, when you've investigated it, and you can only conclude that it is the case. So rather, I would say that its implications for belief, and because that is what we ascribe to Islam, is our belief. We don't have faith in it, but rather we have belief in it due to demonstrable and irrefutable, incontrovertible evidences. So now, people usually think that, certainly many Muslims today usually think that secularism and political philosophy generally is something that is a fringe thing. It's important when it comes to maybe engaging in Western society, but it isn't really important for Muslims, for the problems that travail the Muslim world, for our belief and our ideas. It wouldn't be a problem. It's not related to that. It's a separate thing. It's related to the political side, whereas Islam is about the belief side of things and the personal practice. And to them, I would say that you've already fallen into the trap of secularism, and your mind is secular if you hold that conception. And I don't blame many people for holding that conception in this day and age, unfortunately, because we're born into an era in the West and in the colonialized Muslim countries as well as other non-Western countries, whereby your beliefs about purpose of life and the creator behind life and the universe has no connection to your actual purpose of your lived purpose of life, how you live and what you live for. Now, you might think that this is of minor consequence, but it isn't. When Muslims are told to address shubahats that are arising in the Muslim world, doubts, we approach things very much like a whack-a-mole. Or someone has a doubt, we try to deal with that doubt. If someone else has a doubt, we try to deal with that doubt. And then when there's a rising tidal wave of kind of doubts emerging in different parts of the Muslim world, we just think it just randomly occurs. Like there's no causal factor for that. Unfortunately, there is a causal factor, but fortunately, the way to deal with it is to deal with the root cause rather than dealing with the symptoms. Now, just look at the Christian West, or at least the West. I don't know if it's Christian anymore. Arguably, it might be in some areas, but maybe in most areas not. It used to be a place filled with devout believers in God, devout believers in Christianity, devout believers in Jesus. So what happened? How did you get from that point to a position whereby in England, for example, the majority of people identify as being non-practicing, even nominal Christians, maybe not even believing in Christianity. So now Christianity, or Christians who identify as believing Christians, are actually a minority, and then the rest are actually just maybe a-religious. Maybe they might believe in God, but they're a-religious. There's also a growing proportion, up to maybe a third potentially, of people who identify as not believing in any God at all. So how did you get from that to this situation, from a situation where arguably it was 99.9% belief in God, 99.9% Christian of various denominations, And how did you reach this point? And people don't tend to ask this question. Because you think, but how does politics or how you live relate to your belief in God? Surely the two things are separate. Well, not really, because how you live is based on what? Right? How you act, what you do in life, right? You go to work, right? You go to work based on the belief that you're going to exchange your services and you're going to get money for those services, something that you can then use as a means of exchange to get goods that you want and that you need. So you act based on a belief, and every other acts that you do are based on all kinds of beliefs that you have about your expected reward, the expected value of those actions that you do. So if you live in a society whereby God and concern for God and valuing what God values has no value, generally speaking, no material value, is not considered to be a priority, and people are instead told that your belief in any particular religion becomes just a taste of yours, like the kind of clothes you like to wear, like the flavor of ice cream you like to eat. When you're told this, then religion and God no longer becomes the center point of your life, and something else then must replace that, right? Because people are not going to be vegetables and do nothing. They're going to have to they want to do something, and society tells them what they live for. And in Western society, there are two schools of Aqidah concerning purpose of life, which generally predominate, and they tell people what to live for. The first school of Aqidah, which you can formally call utilitarianism, it tells people that the purpose of their life is to maximize pleasure, maximize sensual gratification, and the consistent sensual gratification that they can acquire, that is called happiness. So that's kind of a very utilitarian approach to that. I know there's different interpretations of utilitarianism amongst utilitarians, and some would say, well, maybe we might, that doesn't mean you're always going to be eating and drinking and so on and so forth, and so obviously engaging in physical intimacy with people. It can also mean higher pleasures like listening to classical music or going to an opera or rap music or whatever, right? So, but whatever the case might be, it's this constant sensual gratification that is happiness. That's their definition. The second school of thought is, they start with British idealists, and they came up with an idea that the purpose of human beings is to achieve self-realization. This emerged from Immanuel Kant's philosophy. I'm not going to get too much into it because it's a bit technical, a bit out of the scope of this discussion. But the purpose of their life is, of human life, is to seek self-realization through a number of things. Either something like fulfilling your potential or being authentically yourself, right? So expressing yourself, achieving your potential to be uniquely yourself, and kind of create that or impose that upon the world, or put yourself upon the world as your uniqueness, quote unquote. So self-realization. Now you'll hear one of these two schools of thought used in TV adverts or commercials, or some would say, for example, live life to the max. Pepsi Max is a very old commercial for those who remember it. Just do it, act on impulse, obviously Nike trainers or sneakers or what have you. That was how they kind of sold their brand. For other people, other adverts or commercials use things like, wear this dress or buy this this particular item of clothing, or basically a particular electronic equipment. Be you, express yourself through these items of clothing which are mass produced in the same pattern, sold to millions of people. But no, your purchase of it will be an expression of your individual uniqueness, and you must realize yourself in the physical world, in the world around you. So now these are the two schools of thought that are in the West, and these two schools of thought are now the replacement for where God was in Western society 100 years ago, 200 years ago. Now, when people have this as a purpose of life, right? When people say, well, this is now what I'm going to do. And sure, you can believe in religion. You can believe in God. You can go to attend services. if that's something that gives you, according to their interpretation, gives you comfort, right? It gives you some kind of calmness, almost like it's an antidepressant. You know, you can use religion as a kind of ideological antidepressant. Right? That's how they use it. That's how they would kind of justify that kind of stuff. Secondly, the other argument they would use is that, well, you know, if you are your choice in your religion, that reflects who you are, who you want to be. Remember, they say pick a religion that suits you, right? This is the second school of thought, the idealist school of thought, which argues that you know, religion or whatever you choose to identify as, what you choose to practice, is just part of the uniqueness that is yourself. And so choose a religion that suits you. Now, from these two schools of thought, you're going to see approaches. You're going to see, you know, different aspects. So, for example, people who are told to choose a religion that represents themselves, religion will just become an identity, right? And in the West, they'll argue that, yeah, we support people's right to religion because they have a right to identify whatever they want to identify with, even if it means that they claim they might be following a religion that, say, you know, I remember from the English Defense League, they used to have this token Muslim who said he didn't believe in God and he didn't believe in the Prophet Muhammad, but he calls himself a Muslim either way. And in the West, they'd say, well, this is, you know, he has a right to identify as Muslim, and you and now while they would say, well, maybe you have a right to say he's not a Muslim, but they would say that you're being socially intolerant to his choices, because if he chooses to identify as a Muslim, even if he doesn't believe in God or the Prophet Muhammad, you're being intolerant to you're getting in the way of his self-realization that will manifest. He's manifesting his unique choices to be or identify as he chooses to be or identify. And likewise, there are other people who would argue that, well, you know, religion being from the utilitarian perspective, being something that gives you some type of fulfillment or some type of antidepressant effect, is a way of enjoyment. And so people will approach religion in a kind of, I call it, spiritual hedonist style, way, whereby they will go for they want to get intense spiritual experiences. They want to do, you know, like you see the rise of Christian charismatic churches. These are churches where basically you have these very, you know, strong charismatic preachers, which are almost like entertainers more than they are ministers who are teaching, you know, edifying lessons and sermons to their people, and giving people these spiritual highs. Right now, to a utilitarian, they'd say, yeah, that's a great role for religion today. And now what you see is, and to this, of course, atheists would then argue that, well, we just don't need religion ourselves, because we view it as a crutch. Like, why can't you get an emotional high through, you know, music or, you know, art or some kind of anthropomorphized cosmology, which I think atheists fall into. They like to do, rather than going to a church or going to a synagogue or a mosque or a temple or anything like this. So they'd say we don't need it. Religion is a crutch for those who need it, but we don't need it. We don't need this antidepressant effect that religion provides. And the atheist response to those who, you know, view it as for self-realization is they'll say, well, we generally respect people's right to identify in a religion if it gives them some kind of expression of their uniqueness, but we don't need that. And secondly, and here's the most important point they would argue, is they would say that, well, why would you do that? Considering that religion isn't a label. Religion has edicts, it has commands, it has a purpose, it has meaning behind it. It has a way of organizing human activity. And this organizing of human activity, these commands, these directives, these recommendations that religion has, this worldview of religion actually runs against the idea of human self-fulfilled realization of the individual, right? Because the individual should realize themselves because to fully reach their potential, because they own themselves. The individual is the only thing that matters. And so if the individual wants to fully realize themselves, fully become their potential as to whatever they want to be, and really kind of externalize themselves upon the world, religion actually is an obstruction to it. If you open up the books, you'll see that all these commands and limitations will go against your individuality, your uniqueness, quote unquote. That's one of the arguments they present. So they argue these kind of 2 points. They argue that religion actually is actually very, they'll say it's illiberal, and by illiberal they mean it's against individual self-realization, and also religion gives you restrictions against doing actions that give you gratification, like drinking alcohol. Of course, they wouldn't say it prevents you from taking crack cocaine, because most atheists, at least in the West, are not libertarians, and they would argue they generally accept that certain types of drugs must be prohibited, which is obviously an internal contradiction amongst their own ideology. But here's the point. They say, if you want to have consensual intimacy with someone who's an adult like yourself, why should you not be allowed to do that if it's just because it's outside of wedlock, just because it's outside of marriage? So they're bringing these kind of arguments up. They'd also bring the argument up that, well, if the purpose of life is pleasure and enjoyment, and the purpose of life is self-realization, then how can a creator punish you for merely pursuing these purposes of life, for getting enjoyment, seeking enjoyment, or seeking self-realization in your life? Now, you might think to yourself that, okay, well, these are atheist arguments. But you see, because Muslims have accepted a secular kind of worldview where religion is confined purely to private acts of worship, or maybe congregational acts of worship and belief, but in life's affairs, well, you've let someone else take the seat on that, take the throne, sat on the throne of that area of affairs. Then Muslims have allowed these other kind of drives or purposes to slip beneath the radar and claim their children, claim themselves, claim their fathers when colonialism came to our countries. Right, so secularism, if you were going to translate it from its original Latin, secularum, secular meaning worldly, the Arabic word for it would be dunyawiya. I know sometimes in the modern Arabic people translate it as almaniya, worldly, but I think it's best described from the Quranic term, at least from dunya and dunyawiya, meaning pertaining only or caring only about this dunya. Now, once you understand it like this, then it becomes very apparent just what kind of the insidiousness of the concept and the term, and why doubts become kind of created and raised up in the minds of Muslims, like it did in the West, when the West stopped being concerned about Christianity, and the Bible was no longer kind of a centrally informing document of their life's affairs. When they didn't need God anymore for their life's affairs, then they simply didn't need God from how they reasoned to themselves. That's the next kind of logical step. I suppose, just to kind of really spell out to you, some people, when they want to give dawah and call to Islam, they want to refute atheism, but they don't want to call for an Islamic revival in the Muslim world and the implementation of Islam as an active way of life. That is referred to as law system, as a system of economics, as a system that drives society and the family unit, and the family being protected according to Islamic morals and values. Because they don't have any drive to implement such a system, what message this gave to our ancestors who were colonized, but what gives to every subsequent generation, is that Muslims believe in God. And they believe that he gave a message to mankind. But this message to mankind, which is meant to determine life's affairs, because life's affairs can only be determined by purpose. And if humans have a purpose of life, it must be then to worship God, and that must encompass every aspect of our life and our existence. You can't be a part-time creation of God, can you? You have to be a full-time creation of God, because that's what you are. So what your children will see is that they see you are totally happy and well-adjusted, living in a world where no one really refers to the message that God has given mankind to actually live in society, to drive society, to solve problems in human affairs. And when I use the word politics, don't be thrown off by that, again, because this is our secular understanding of it. Politics just means life's affairs. In theory, you going out and going to work is politics. You going and negotiating a salary is politics. You selling your goods for a price is actually politics. You discussing water distribution in your local, let's say, area or council area or community area, let's say, is politics. So you raising concerns about the quality of water, or about electricity distribution, or about the homeless. This is all politics. That's how in the ancient world, that's how they would describe it. This is politics, politeia, pertaining to living in a city, right? The affairs of life, living in a city. And the word politeia actually sometimes is translated as constitution in Greek, but its actual meaning is dean. So politeia, which is Aristotle's kind of term that he used, and he was the one who popularized it, upon which the word is now politics was based from, Aristotle. The word politeia means a dean, a way of life of a people. And this is how the ancient Greeks understood politeia. It means dean. So when you're saying separate religion from politics, you're saying separate dean from dean, which is actually ridiculous as a proposition. But see how now the children are understanding this. They grow up and they see a society in the Muslim world where Muslims are consciously not referring to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in their daily lives, not as on an individual level, but also on a societal level. Right? So God's message is no longer suitable, is seen as not suitable for being implemented. It can't address human affairs. It can't address human problems. God is silent on how humans should live according to their purpose of life, if it even is their purpose of life. That's how your children are going to see a society devoid of Islam. And of course, ultimately, then it's only the next logical step from that is, well, if God is silent on life's affairs and how humans can live and how to solve human problems, then is in essence a silent God, and a silent God is really no God at all. And that's where atheism and this shubuhat arises from. So it not only arises from the fact that you have these kind of purpose of lives that have kind of replaced what used to be the centrality of God. These other moral systems that have replaced materialistic moral systems, which they're not even justifiable, but even then intellectually, but they're just being taken as a dogmatic given. Now we live by it. Now we operate by this. Now, not only this, but also the fact that people see people not referring to God's commands to solve problems in life's affairs means that God's message is insufficient to solve life's affairs, and therefore it can't be from God. And if there is no other message, then maybe there is no God. If there's no commands that can be validated or worthy of being referenced to, then there would be no God. And that's how atheists would arise. That's how they arise in secular societies. You can't just have a secular society without the inevitable rise of atheists. Religion will only be retained as a cultural artifact at best by such societies. And this is the issue now, and it really boils down to, I suppose, a lot of it is people fail to see the connection between action and belief. Now, I know that there's different schools of thought regarding action and belief regarding Islamic discussions. However, I think where there is a general consensus is that there has to be a minimum of action to justify yourself as a Muslim, that action being your shahada, your declaration of your shahada, and the fact that you can't just willfully bow down in front of idols and say, well, without any compulsion, if no one's compelling you to, and you willfully bow down in front of idols and you utter a prayer to the idol, you can't argue then, well, my belief in my heart was different to what my action was doing, because, well, where's your action coming from? And I like to kind of say that, so when people see there's no connection between belief and action, or they say faith is in the heart, right? This is a very secular worldview, very secular concept where your life's affairs are separate from your beliefs. But it's as ridiculous as arguing that a computer's the operations a computer does, the programs a computer has, the apps that it has no relation to the code in its RAM and its hard drive. It has no relation to the actual code, the programming code that it contains within itself, right? That its operations, its activities has no relation to the code in itself. They can be two separate things. Well, no, because your operations come from somewhere. The computer's operations will come from somewhere. These apps will come from somewhere. What it does must come from its programming code. And as Muslims, whatever action you do comes from your heart, in essence. The point of it, obviously, of our life is to change our heart, right? To remove all the falsehoods that have been crept in, and also to remove the bad habits, the bad tastes that are in our heart. But we know that if someone has fully, wholeheartedly embraced doing bad things and has no regret at all, no compunction of guilt about doing any the worst bad deeds, then the iman can be questioned, right? If they don't even have regret, or they don't even feel it's wrong in any way, or they don't feel a pang of remorse slightly, then there's no even a mustard seed of iman left in that person, right? So actions and iman are connected. Now, the iman of a society is basically its way of life, and when you've removed Islam as a way of life of society, the iman of society will not be based on Islam, will not be based on God, and slowly, collectively, society will slowly veer away from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, away from belief in God, away from referring to his message, and you're going to see the rise of atheists. And I think to finish off, I don't know how much time I have left, but to finish off, I'd say that in secular worldview, certainly in the liberal kind of Western worldview that we have in the West today, and is being sold in the Muslim world, when you remove God as the owner of all things, as the creator and owner of all things, what you have is that you have people as the owner of themselves, right? So individualism is basically the argument that the humans own their own self, even though humans didn't make ourselves, even though we didn't make ourselves. We didn't create ourselves. We couldn't determine what we were. We don't determine when we die. The individual argues that we make ourselves, and therefore, when Islam or any kind of religion has commands where people interpret these commands as being demand requests for human beings to follow rules and to have certain purposes greater than self-satisfaction of the individual. Then this creates doubts in people's minds about these commands. Saying, well, why is God want me to do things for him? I'm an individual. I'm separate from him. I own my own self. Why is he going to punish me if I'm going to do something consensual that's not harming other people, not harming other people's ownership of their own selves, right? And this automatically obviously rejects and refutes the concept that God owns everything, right? God owns individuals. And when Muslims encounter this, they have this idea of concept that the just consent of adults is sufficient to make something good. Then when they seek prohibitions against extramarital or premarital relationships, people doing interest banking with their own property, I own this money. If I choose to voluntarily lend it out to somebody expecting a higher rate of return, and they consent to that, then what's wrong with this activity? Or if I'm just enjoying myself taking drugs, why am I going to get punished in hell for this when it's my property? I'm kind of disposing with my body, right? This idea, and of course many other such concepts as well. But the idea of ownership of the self, individualism, which arises from a secular mindset, which was the replacing ideology when God was taken out of the picture. This is one of the major causes of doubt and the implications of faith. It denies and refutes faith completely. And I think in the words of Hugo Grotius, which was an Enlightenment thinker in the West, when they were trying to bring this new law that would supplant Christianity, he said that we must believe in a natural law and we must obviously determine, deduce, and formulate a natural law whose precepts would be true even if God didn't exist. Right? Hugo Grotius is saying this in the 17th century. Now, what he unleashed was the idea that, well, these are laws or natural moralities or whatever arguments you want to use, which obviously they're not natural. You can't deduce them from nature. But anyway, this argument was basically an argument for material morality that was greater than God, because if God doesn't exist, it would still be true. And so therefore, it doesn't need God, doesn't rely on God. And when they implemented this materialistic morality, which doesn't rely on God, they made human beings or their subsequent generations gradually start to believe that they didn't need God, and if they didn't need God, then God didn't exist. And this is what the implications of secularism upon belief, and something that we have to pay attention to, but not something we have to deal with just by doing dawah and refutations and apologetics, but also rather to actively revive the Muslim world and make Islam and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's word the highest point and the reference point for all our life's affairs, and live like what we are, creations of God whose purpose is only to serve God, and upon which we revolve only around his will and his command. Should I just answer some questions then on this chat? So someone said, who was the Enlightenment individual I referenced? Hugo Grotius. I will try to write it out for you. Here we go. Hugo Grotius. Well, he wasn't the only person, but he was one of the main individuals which brought in, this kind of idea of natural rights. I mean, natural rights has now been debunked through a number of different schools of thought, but now what we are left today is with utilitarianism and a form of political idealism, which was the basis behind which these two schools of thought are the basis behind which you have modern liberalism, or what is technically called social liberalism, the current ideology we have today. Just as a side point, just so I could actually, just a small caveat. The reason why cocaine is banned today and not alcohol, well, they tried to ban alcohol, but the reason why they allow alcohol but they don't allow cocaine is it was argued that even though someone who takes cocaine is doing it out of their own consent, cocaine is something that enslaves in the individuals and prevents them from being self-realized, right? So it causes enslavement of people, and so that's why they banned cocaine. And I think Thomas Hill Green was one of the British idealists arguing for this, and he was banning the banning of alcohol. He was part of the temperance movement, but it didn't work out. And in America, they tried to ban alcohol, but people kept drinking it. So they just, practically speaking, had to relent from the prohibition. So, their ideology is full of contradictions because, well, if alcohol can enslave you, also and cocaine can enslave you, then why not the fashion industry? Why not that can enslave you? What about the expectation, pressure to have sex in society? How about that? Why is that not an enslavement as well? How commercials and advertisements which make you want things that you don't actually need? Why is that not enslavement? They don't know. They are trying to make individuals the masters and God, right, in essence, and not to be slave to anything else. But they can't stop from being slaves to themselves. And as we know in the Quran, which says that those who basically have made themselves Rabb, made themselves lords, they're worse than cattle. Reason being is that a cattle doesn't have free will, and therefore it didn't have the choice to basically to follow its impulses, whereas humans have the choice, but they still follow their impulses. So those particular human beings who've made themselves Rabb. So that's kind of that's just to briefly to kind of discuss that. And someone said rap music equals higher pleasure. I was just giving an example because someone might say that classical music might be too upper class of an example. So I thought, okay, well, I'll give a more commonly, middle class and whatever, that a lot of people like rap music or choose the genre you want for your example. But people basically like to, the idea is behind utilitarianism is to fulfill yourself through any sensual gratification or means that you have available and you can exercise. Right, is there anyone else? Any other questions? I think someone said, how do we establish khilafah? I mean, by that you mean an Islamic ruling system. It's a bit of a different discussion, but in essence, in its most simplest of senses, if all Muslims, or rather if a critical mass of Muslims in the Muslim world agreed to want to live by that system and ruling across the section of society, because the people aren't just civilians, the society includes the judiciary, military, administrators, scientists, economists. If a critical mass of all these different segments of society basically understood and wanted to take that seriously, understood what Islamic law is, what it looks like, how it's implemented, and understood how it can solve problems, then you'd have it done. Society is just a connection, a collection of interrelations based on people's ideas. If you change people's ideas, their society will change inevitably. The practical method of changing ideas can vary from campaigning to political campaigning to obviously educational means and measures, but that's a different discussion. If you change the ideas and thoughts of society, the society will change. You can't just simply tell Muslims live by Islam, because they don't know what that means, right? They don't know what an economic system looks like, an Islamic economic system looks like. Many of them don't even know what economics even means as a concept, right? It just means what money, right? Well, it means more than that. They don't even know the Islamic understanding or definition of these terms, which, i.e., a system of distribution or managing system of distribution of resources, and they don't know what a ruling system would look like. They don't know what rights they have in Islamic government, right? If you don't know these things, then how can you implement those things? How can you establish those things? So the Muslim world needs to basically be taught and be inculcated with these ideas, and then inevitably change will occur. The only question is, how quickly can we implement this change? And that could depend on what political process or political tactics or strategy you do, and what, how much people you have behind you, and so on and so forth. But generally speaking, it's inevitable. Once you aim to teach this to the Muslim world, you invite the Muslim world. You learn it yourself. That's the first step, and then invite the Muslim world to it. The change will be inevitable. Let's have a look at other questions.
Assalamu alaikum, ustadh.
Wa alaikum salam.
There's actually a Q&A tab, and just to let you know, you have a little under 1 minute left.
Sure.
Can you see the Q&A tab?
Yes, no, I've been reading from it.
Okay, beautiful.
It's I'm just trying to just find one last question. Can someone write down the two schools of thoughts of Aqidah in the West? So it's the two schools of Aqidah in terms of ethical Aqidah. So utilitarianism and idealism, right, being the two predominant schools of modern day liberalism. Any other questions? I think that's pretty much almost all of them. Muslims aren't ready for today's world. We are trying to fight, and we are trying to fight secularism. I mean, I don't know if that's a question or not. I'm merely pointing out, when I say Muslims aren't ready for today's world, I'm saying that as Muslims, right? So as those who implement Islam, believe in Islam, if we don't know how to do that, how Islam can actually solve problems, how it has superior solutions to the current available solutions in the world today. If you don't know those things, you don't know answer those questions, then you can't call for it, and you can't fight against secularism, because secularism is the argument that God is best kept in the mosque and not outside it, and that is, or in the church and not outside it, or in a compartmentalized part of your brain, never to be implemented in daily affairs. If you don't know actually how God relates to your daily affairs, and how it relates to the daily affairs of society and of humanity as a whole, as the world project of Islam, if you don't even know what that is, and what it looks like, what the Prophet Muhammad was striving to create when he set up the Islamic city-state of Medina and expanded it, and all the changes he made and what he was aiming for, if you don't know those things, and you don't know how they relate to today's world, then you can't. Then I'll say Muslims as Muslims are not ready for today's world. And the key to revival is to be ready by learning, studying, and calling your fellow Muslims to do those solutions, to make Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala the central axis of their life, central pivot upon which all of things revolve around.
Okay. Jazakallah khair.
Barakallahu feekum, ustadh. Very, very beautiful talk. For sure, we've seen this as a consistent theme of making Allah Jalla Jalala your pivot point, as you rightfully put. For sure, Islam is not just a personal religion, as we all know. And you rightfully showed how secularism has many, many inconsistencies, and Islam for sure is the solution.